Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Should I go out there? Good afternoon, everyone in Glasgow, and good day to everyone, our online audiences. I'm really excited that we could spend the afternoon together here talking about some new research we have been doing under a larger program on climate-compatible growth, sponsored generously by the FCDO. Over the past year or so, teams at the World Bank and at universities in the UK have been putting together empirical and analytic research that links to the links between climate change and economic development, with a large focus on mitigation, but also in adaptation. Today's panel, you will see there are different facets to this conversation. We will have data from pictures of the Earth taken from the sky. There's micro-level data, as well as other systems-level information. I'm super excited to join you and moderate this conversation, and I'd like to turn it over to our other co-chair now.
Thanks very much, Somik, and my name is Alex Money, and I'm the CCG lead at the University of Oxford under this stream. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. So as Somik mentioned, this is an integrating theme where we look at innovation, adaptation, and policy and different dimensions of that. And we're very lucky to have a very strong set of speakers and panelists to make their contributions. So the format is we'll invite speakers to speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll cycle through the four different speakers in the first instance, and then have a good amount of time to open the floor to questions from the audience, both in the room and remotely via Slido. So with that, let me introduce our first panelist, who is in fact Somik Lall from the World Bank Group. So Somik, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So should I, Alex, start the first presentation?
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, great. So if you could kindly turn on the slides. I should sit here. No, not stand there. So good afternoon, everyone, again. My name is Somik Lall. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some really new research that colleagues of mine at the World Bank and I have been doing on what I call space-through development. And in this research, we have been looking at how new data that are pictures of the Earth taken from the sky at very high resolution can provide us with verifiable, independent measurement of CO2 concentration at any part on the Earth's surface. And using that data, we provide new metrics on decomposing what city-level emissions look like for about 1,200 large metropolitan areas in the world. So here, the main contribution in our research has been to update a lot of local measures of CO2 concentration. And what I mean update is that if you were to look at carbon dioxide concentration in most parts of the world at the local level, these are modeled estimates. And remember this word, they're modeled, they're not measured. That means that they come from engineering studies, they come from technical studies, and they are calibrated, and often the calibrations that are used for developing countries are very much based on parameter estimates that come from developed countries. And also local economic conditions, income demand structures are often poorly measured in these calibrations. And also when you look at the national numbers of concentration, most of the models are national, and they do some sort of scaling down effect to get local parameters. So we feel that if we were to make real progress in terms of monitoring carbon emissions and make it relevant for developing countries, we need a strategy that really focuses on empirical measurement. So here, what we have been doing over the past 6 months at the World Bank is that we have been using new sources of data taken from satellites. And right now what we found is that the US, through NASA, has a very strong program of these satellites called OCO2 and OCO3 that measure CO2 concentrations. But they're not the only one. The European Space Agency, through its Sentinel-5P program, is measuring methane, and Japan's Space Exploration Program, GOSTAT, is measuring both CO2 concentrations and methane concentrations. But what we do is that we focus on the OCO2 data because it goes back to 2014. It's measured pretty much at a daily frequency, and it's open source. It can be downloadable, free of cost, to anyone, anywhere in the world. So this is a really first source of direct, independent, low-cost, and objective measurement of CO2 concentrations. So what are we really measuring? So in this measurement question, when you measure the data from satellites in terms of local concentrations, which is our interest, there are three main components before you get to the local concentration numbers. First is that every pixel that the satellite data picks up has an inherent trend line that's based in it. That means as the world is going from CO2 concentration levels closer to 400 or 386 about 6 years ago to about 417 today, those trends are kind of built in, and no matter when you pick up a data point, you need to control for these global trends. The second thing one needs to think about and control for before coming to local estimates is seasonality. CO2 concentrations are very different in the Northern Hemisphere, and the amplification of those CO2 concentrations vary a lot because of vegetation in the Northern Hemisphere. It looks different in different parts of the year. By contrast, in the Southern Hemisphere, it's much more kind of flatlined. And finally, after that, we come to the distribution of local emissions concentration at the city level. So in fact, our data that we use filters out these global trends, these seasonal effects, and comes up with local CO2 numbers. And what we also do in this research is try to decompose the CO2 concentration at a local level to major sources of CO2 emissions. We looked at fossil fuel-fired power plants, we looked at refineries, steel mills, cement plants, motor vehicles, agriculture fires, heating, and trash burning. And these are really the main sources. And for this, friends, we have now compiled the first ever georeference data set in the world on power plants. We know exactly capacity and intensity of every plant down to the geo-coordinate. We know when it was built and what technology it's used. We know information on every refinery, steel mill, and every large cement plant in the world. Cement being very important, we kind of mapped it out, and funnily enough, in countries like Morocco, there's a huge concentration of cement plants, far overriding anything Morocco would consume, presumably to supply to markets in Europe. So using the sources of CO2 emissions and these decompositions, we built a very basic and very straightforward econometric model that allows us to predict what are the CO2 concentration levels in a place and what are the main drivers. And we show that, in fact, energy sources account for about 40% of all emissions. It varies across regions. Industrial sources, another 30%. But what's really important in this research is that for the first time, we back out the income component of consumption related to CO2 concentration. And our research shows that when you look at CO2 concentration and incomes, just like in other parts of environmental economics, we have an inverse U curve. And that means that we have a peak at around $40,000 per capita of CO2 concentrations. But this is a really disturbing picture, because if, as business as usual, countries are going to go to higher incomes of 40,000 before they turn down the curve, then we're going to burn through the carbon budget left in the world very, very quickly. We really need to think about aggressive ways of bending this curve downwards. So based on that research, we build a predictive model in which we can actually predict CO2 emissions and then see what the real emissions are compared to the prediction. And the difference between the prediction and the real measurement is your carbon CO2 performance, because we control for all the other background factors. And what we do is to kind of see what kind of countries are doing well and who are not in terms of managing CO2 concentration, given your economic and demographic fundamentals. And we find that, in fact, the worst performance is in China, in parts of Africa and East Asia, and in fact, the former Soviet countries, EU and India, are actually doing relatively well. We have a working paper that's going to be published next week where you can get more details. But I'm going to leave you with a couple of maps that I think will show you the extent to which these data are very useful. So say you're a local policymaker and you want to think about targeting the biggest sources of emissions, you don't have to go with national distributions. And here, for every local source, every city, we have a different emissions profile. So if you're a mayor of a city in China, like Beijing, versus somewhere in the middle of the country, like Chongqing, you'll have a different priority. Same thing in India. If you're a mayor of a city in Chennai or the mayor of Mumbai, your priorities are very different. And in fact, these data are very useful because it'll also tell you that if energy, say, is the most important source of emissions in your city, but you as a city leader doesn't have the remit to influence energy production itself, you have to work with national line ministries in order to kind of make any dent in action. Do I have one more minute? Okay, great. So I'm going to wrap up with this last minute slide that just want to recall and say the main contributions of this work is that this is the first satellite-based monitoring of CO2 concentrations locally. It allows us for global, independent, objective measurement of GHG emissions at the city level. Second, if you were to judge performance from a policy perspective, it requires you to control for normal events such as population growth, emissions growth more generally, and that's why these econometric residuals that we come up with are really useful for policy analyses. And third, I think this is just the beginning of the way in which we can start tracking the gains from impact investments and sustainability initiatives. Say you're an investor and you are thinking about a sustainability bond, and you and you invest and provide sustainability investment in a city or a locality. How do you know that these bonds are really, or these incentive initiatives are really translating into concentration management? Well, now you have a tool that you can look at pretty much the data on a weekly basis, week over week across years, right? So now you can see whether what I'm doing at the local level has any local benefits. Let me stop here and thank you for your time.
Somik, thanks so much for that contribution. I think I was really struck by your opening observation that this distinction between measurement and modeling is really where the rubber hits the road, and being able to discern, if you like, the true carbon performance. Not only does it, as you say, to your last point, make it possible to anchor this into the sort of results-based financing models that we're all talking about and expecting to be able to use more in catalyzing private capital and other capital out of the savings pools and into the developing world where this capital is well needed. But also, it's a really interesting way, I think, to think about things such as non-stationarity. So that there may be things that are going on, which by having this residual methodology, plus the fact that this is measured rather than modeled, will just flag things that are going on that might otherwise not be captured if you were just, if you were looking at this in a more linear, modeled way. So I think there's some really interesting framings there, which I hope we can build on a little bit further with the rest of our panelists. So thank you for that. We're moving on. It's my pleasure now to welcome as our second panelist and speaker, Matt Kahn also from the World Bank, who will be giving us some comments that he has around adaptation and mitigation. And with that, Matt, if I could hand the microphone to you. Thank you very much.
Alex, thank you, and good morning from Los Angeles. I want to talk to you in my brief remarks as I watch the clock tick down about the climate change adaptation challenge and our work. And I'm working with a great team who I learned so much from This is a preliminary report on our work in progress on the microeconomics of adapting to climate change. Climate change scares the hell out of me, and I'm at root an optimist that if we anticipate a challenge of the incentives we have as people, firms, and governments, how do we do a better job of not being passive victims? And how do we set up markets and our institutions to help people in the developing world, middle income countries, and richer countries to better adapt to this challenge that we've collectively unleashed? Folks, I greatly hope, as a lifelong economist who's married to an economist whose son is trading as an economist, that Microeconomic Insights will help us to adapt to this challenge. We all know that every location on Earth is facing a vector of place-based challenges. In our new empirical work, we are using lights at night dynamics in major cities around the world monthly for the last 10 years to study the overall effects when shocks hit cities, when floods hit cities. How much does economic activity decline in these cities, and how quickly do different cities recover? Folks, in thinking about the microeconomic research agenda of how cities cope with anticipated shocks, people have a vector of activities they can engage in to self-protect. Where do they locate in the city? What efforts do they take? If Miami and Florida faces sea level rise, who can invest in stilts? What actions can be taken in terms of architecture to protect a place? How do we set up land use patterns? What land do we allow people to live on? These are examples of self-protection, efforts individuals take to protect themselves. An air conditioner is an example of self-protection. There's also public protection of the place. In the United States, levies have been invested in. In the developing world, there's issues of municipal finance and tax collection and bond issuance of how you pay for local public goods and how effective are these local public goods in protecting a place. Self-insurance. If I'm a farmer in Bangladesh, do I plant lower return, less risky crops that are more less drought sensitive? And if that's a type of self-insurance to protect myself from shocks. Market insurance, of course, in developed countries, people can purchase life insurance, fire insurance. There are issues of how our access to these products and the interplay between these is what I'd like to tell you about in my final slide. Whoops, I skipped a slide. I think I want to come here to show you the key interplay. Folks, what our project is about anticipating unintended consequences. So since this is a complicated figure where I want to spend the bulk of my time, let's look at this. Is it the case that when government invests to protect a place at risk in the developed or the developing world, does such investment, is it a complement or a substitute for private insurance? In the United States, if levees are built in a place facing sea level rise or flood risk, do more people move to the place because they anticipate that they're safe? If that's the case, then does public investment actually protect the people? This needs to be answered on a case-by-case basis. I want policymakers anticipating that this question. So if it's the case that when you invest to make a place safer, if that attracts more people to move to the hazard, policymakers need to anticipate this effect. And so that's what we mean by this point. Does public investment crowd in or crowd out private investment and self-protection? So I'm still waking up this morning. I apologize. I just did the left side. Does public investment strengthen or discourage private adaptation? So I apologize. I give myself a B minus. On the left side of this diagram is the point that if when government invests in protecting a place, if people invest less in protecting themselves, then an unintended consequence of government investment, we don't get as much safety as we would have expected. That's the left side, and that needs to be studied on a case-by-case basis. Folks, in thinking about people's self-protection investment, there's key issues of are they aware of the risks that are unfolding? The people at COP26 are well aware of the risks that are unfolding. I'm very optimistic that climate science is making pinpoint progress to help us to understand these risks. A crucial role that the participants at COP26 can play is to help to disseminate this information. If people have access to valid real-time information about place-based risk of fire risk, heat, flood risk, they're more likely to invest in self-protection. That's necessary but not sufficient. They need also to have the income to invest in this. Poor people, of course, face the greatest adaptation challenges from climate change. And there's an imperative for economic growth to help to raise poor people's incomes, to give them the resources to help themselves. Folks, the right side of the document. In the insurance market, does improved risk pricing encourage self-protection? This is the old economics question of moral hazard, and let me explain this two ways. If Matthew lives in Florida, and if he has really good, cheap housing insurance, does that attract him to the area? And does he build his house in a way such that if it floods, I just get a big check from the market insurance? Market insurance can encourage greater self-protection if insurers can write nonlinear contracts in the following way. If a market insurer could say to Matthew, if you live in a risky place, but if you take these precautions, we will charge you less for your premium. So a key issue going forward is the sophistication of the insurance industry, the rise of the insurance industry. The insurance industry can encourage self-protection if it has pinpoint information about the risks that people face, and it incentivizes self-protection investment. So this diagram is at the heart of our thinking in both developed and developing countries, where a key role is for insurers to pinpoint data on risks and to have the ability to incentivize product purchasers to be aware of the risks they face and to be proactive in investing in protecting themselves. Folks, my final slide. Something that I firmly believe is that economic development is key to building up resilience. Poor people face the greatest risk from climate change. My students at USC are clear with me that their concern with capitalism is how do the poor cope, and what rules of the game would improve the poor's quality of life. It is crucial to help the poor in developed and developing countries to be able to help themselves. And in our own work, we are doing a better job identifying slum areas in cities and trying to understand with our lights at night methodology which parts of the world. We're developing a diagnostics tool. In which cities around the world do poor areas recover faster? We seek to survey in those areas to learn under what circumstances are the poor more resilient in the face of natural disasters. Folks, finally, on this theme of unintended consequences, we're also exploring the role of public infrastructure, of dams. We think and we hope that upstream dams protect cities from floods, but is it the case that they attract, in a system of cities, are more people moving to these cities with dams? And when we think about investing in infrastructure, have policymakers internalized the importance and the interplay of the three factors here? We will be better able to adapt to climate change if we can get in sync self-protection, private insurance, and public investment. So this is our triangle of success, if I could be a professor for 2 seconds. And folks, thank you very much.
Matt, thank you so much for your comments. And I remember when I was studying economics, being taught that the road to hell is often paved by good intentions, and this whole argument of causal feedback loops and this idea of moral hazard and unintended consequences, I think, is really well described in that diagram. It also makes a very good segue and connection, I think, to Somik's work on emphasizing the local and in many cases the hyperlocal, both in terms of giving decision-ready information for insurers in understanding these risks, but also from a policy perspective, to see the consequences of decisions made and understanding those at scale, and as you rightly say, directing capital allocation as a consequence. So thank you very much for those two bridges. It's now my pleasure to move us on to our third speaker, who is Pia Andres, part of our home team at CCG. And Pia will be talking to us a little bit about country-specific competitive strengths and potential future opportunities in the green economy. So again, keeping this at a local scale. So with that, Pia, could I hand the microphone over to you? Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about green competitiveness and green jobs by extension. Over the past few years and months, and especially also during this conference, we've heard a lot about green jobs. So, for example, 2 days ago, US President Biden made some remarks at this conference saying that when he looks at climate and dealing with climate change, he sees jobs, good jobs, economic development and movement, and that the global transition to net zero economy is predicated on 30 million jobs worldwide by 2030. And you see here on my first slide an article from Green Tech Media from last year, but I think it kind of captures the idea. You see some people talking about their work in solar project finance, and they're all looking very happy and very excited, designing solar panels, financing solar panels, installing solar panels. And that's what we often think about when we hear green jobs. We think about people installing solar panels, people building wind turbines, people transitioning into these new green jobs. Now, here you see an article, a more recent article in the Financial Times entitled "Not All Green Jobs Are Safe and Clean," and you see a worker descending into a cobalt mine. And so the transition to clean technology is going to require a lot of metals, especially copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium, which are used for technologies such as solar panels, wind turbines, EV batteries, and the like. And about 70% of global cobalt output are currently produced in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where it's well known that there are a lot of issues around things like child labor or very dangerous working conditions. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we can learn from economic geography about how to prevent things like this from happening. So what we don't want is rich countries reaping all the good jobs and developing countries exporting all the mining output. We want there to be good, decent jobs everywhere, right? And so part of our work in the CCG Oxford's Plan project is to look at how we can use insights from existing literatures on economic geography, economic complexity, to learn more about how that can be done. So what you see in this picture is, on this slide, you see a graphic from a 2007 paper by Hidalgo and co-authors that introduced the so-called product space approach. And you can see a network of different industrial sectors. And what you can see immediately is that in the center of the product space network, things are a lot denser. So you have a lot of sectors that are very close to each other. And as you go into the periphery, you see that products and sectors are kind of further away from each other. And I don't know how big these slides are in the room, but essentially in the core, you have things like heavy machinery, these sort of very complex industrial activities. And in the periphery, you have things like textiles, mining, fossil fuel extraction, and similar activities. And This network is constructed using trade data, just bilateral trade data, which we can use to infer how often products are co-exported and which countries are good at exporting which products. And it tends to, and we can infer things about these products' complexity, which is correlated with value added, also from this data. So it's a very simple approach that can tell us quite a lot, and it has very strong predictive power. So what we know is that if you have competitive advantage in a particular product, then you're much more likely to, in the future, develop competitive advantage in a product that is similar to this product and other products that you're already good at exporting. So to give an illustrative example, if you are very good at making cars, maybe you will also become good at making motorcycles, even if you're not currently good at it. But the problem with this is that countries can get locked into low value added industrial paths, because if the things that you're good at making are mining exports, all sorts of natural resource extraction and other activities that are located in the periphery of this network, it's going to be much more difficult for you to move into the products that are in the core of this network. Whereas other countries that are already making a lot of things that are located in the core will have a much easier time. And therefore, in a way, they have a head start. And this is where policy should come in. And a lot of activity in this literature so far has focused on taking advantage of low-hanging fruit, so using existing latent comparative advantage, like products that are close to the ones you're already good at making, but that are maybe higher in complexity, higher in value added, and trying to transition into those. But the problem with this is that if the products that are very similar to what you're already good at making are all low in value added and they're all kind of located in the periphery, then that's not going to get you very far. And so what we need to learn more about is how can you break out of these paths? How can policy help you move from the periphery into the core, and into these high value added activities that hopefully will create these good paying jobs that we've heard so much about. So on this slide, you see a screenshot from an online web tool that my colleague Penny Mealy and I have developed based on Penny's earlier research applying the product-based approach to a green economy. And what you see here is a map of the world, and it is colored by the so-called Green Complexity Index, which measures the number and complexity of the green products that countries are very good at producing and exporting competitively. And green products, importantly here, doesn't refer to how clean your production process is, but it refers to products that are useful for greening the economy. So technologies for wastewater treatment, renewable energy production, EV batteries, and things like that. And you see immediately that Europe is very dark green, which means that a lot of European countries are very high in green complexity, green competitiveness. And you can't see the whole map, but what you see, for example, of African countries on this map tends to be much more lightly colored. So there's definitely some work to do here. And what you can also do in this web tool that we've developed is you can look at each country and you can look at which green products it's already competitive at producing and which green products it's not currently competitive in but could be in the future, how complex these products are, and how similar they are to existing competitive capabilities, which tells you something about how easy or difficult it will be to move into them. And you can also see a bunch of other stats about the products and the green categories they refer to, why they're green, who's exporting them currently, who's importing them, and so on. And we hope that this is a tool that can help policymakers all over the world at least get a better idea of where they're currently standing on green competitiveness. So in conclusion, we know that industrial development is path dependent, but we need to better understand what enables path breaking diversification, what drives relatedness between products. We already know, at least in theory and from some empirical evidence, that it's input-output linkages, skills, labor market pooling, and knowledge spillovers. That's kind of the theory of Marshallian and Jacobs externalities. But we want to understand better, especially with respect to the green economy, how important each of these linkages are and how policy can help overcome low value added development paths. That's it for me. Thank you.
Pia, thank you so much. So one of the things that I took out from that is this challenge of path dependency, and if we want to see this transition take place, the requirement for countries to be able to adapt and evolve up the value spectrum and be active participants in both the technological and the intellectual value that's going to be created through this transition. There need to be more effective transfer mechanisms and transition mechanisms, and understanding the role that policy may play in contributing to that certainly comes through. So thank you very much for sharing your research and work on that. Just before I go to our last but certainly not least speaker, Dr. Philipp Trotter, just to flag that there's lots of very, very good questions coming through Slido. So thank you all for participating in that. Rick, with your permission, I may just take a few of those questions from the room after Philipp has spoken, and then maybe cut back to you as we come to close, if that's all right. So just to flag that to you. Anyway, with that, let me stop talking and hand this back over now to Dr. Philipp Trotter, also part of CCG and a co-lead of this stream here in Oxford. And Philipp will be talking about policy mixes to foster business model innovation in sub-Saharan Africa. And over to you, Philipp.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex, and everyone for these fantastic contributions. I think this whole session has really been around policy at the center of driving green transitions. Here we've heard from Somik how important data is to inform policies. We have then heard from Matt and Pia sort of one on the household level and also on kind of an whole economy level. Some of the key things that policies have to really influence in order for these green transitions to happen, and I found it really interesting how some of them have to happen individually on a household level. Pia has talked a lot about kind of the whole economy as an aggregate. I would love to take kind of a medium scale between the two and talk about the private sector specifically and how policy is important there to drive business model innovations that can really spur a green growth in emerging economies. Now, here's a picture of how fish logistics look in Uganda right now. So this is a picture a friend of mine took, and you see this giant fish here, this Nile perch fish that is being transported. I think it's from Uganda to Kampala. It's around, I don't know, maybe 100 kilometers, 200, something like that. So it's a really long drive that you have to do. So you can imagine what this fish is going to be like once it gets there. So this is certainly not necessarily the most sustainable way. And there's so many things wrong kind of with this picture. How can we fix this, and how can policy actually fix this? And I think one aspect of driving the green transition that's been very clear in Pia's talk as well, I think, is through the private sector and through private investments. But if the business models that the private sector pursue are not able to deliver on sustainable development, it's probably no good. So the question is, how do policies really foster business models where these certain situations and the challenges that are associated with it can be overcome? Here's a little bit of a framework. I don't want to go into this too much, but there is if you think about what how sustainability transitions can work, you need to have you need to, and we've heard this throughout this conference. I think that there's a need to look at system level change. I think we've seen this very well with the diagram Matt has shown. We've seen it very well with Pia's talk, how these interlinkages come into play. So it's not necessarily sufficient to just look at one specific sector or business, but you actually have to look at system-wide implications of whatever these different things are linked to, and then couple that with operations that are capable of delivering on sustainability transitions. And then you need this kind of enabling environment, and that's really what I want to talk about here today. So you have business models that need to deliver on the different sustainability challenges that were all, quite apparent, I think, in this picture of the fish value chain in Uganda. And in order to do that, you need finance, and we, have had another session on that. And you also need policies in order to come up with this. The business model innovation that we've studied in sub-Saharan Africa, and this whole work is based on, is one that takes this integrated approach where you kind of move away from just looking at one sector or two sectors and really integrate them in a whole and see what kind of synergies you can get from doing so. So the business, the traditional business model in fish value chain is just, okay, here in the Ugandan case, here's a fish, here's a motorcycle, go drive it somewhere. And the traditional business model for mini grids, solar mini grids, which I guess most of you might be familiar with, is you just install some solar panels in a village, you hook up some households and try to sell the electricity through that and meet some basic energy needs, right? The trouble with this traditional business model really is that it is not. It doesn't pay itself. So it's very heavily reliant on subsidies, and the World Bank has been very heavily invested in coming up with policies to support mechanisms to finance these mini grids. Trouble is that they kind of stop short. And these mini grids are then, each and every one of them will be dependent on the subsidies. So you can only build as many as however many subsidies you have. But the challenge of getting renewable energy or sustainable energy access to hundreds of millions of people is probably not going to solve that way. What now African entrepreneurs and African businesses have started to do is actually look at the power that energy has for sustainable development and really put that into a business model that says, okay, we can build a mini grid, but we can also build an ice plant on top of that. It actually only increases your capex by 10 to 20%. But if you calculate what you can get from every single kilowatt hour that turns water into ice, you can actually sell that for around $1 per kilowatt hour. Whereas if you just produce electricity and you just you sell it to households, you can get around 20 cents. So it's a factor of 5 on in terms of the profitability of each kilowatt hour. So now you can build a bigger system, use the money from the productive uses to reduce food loss, increase fisher incomes, and actually through the generated income cross-subsidize energy access for households and make it more affordable. So this integrated approach is really interesting, how you can actually kind of capture that. And now from a policy perspective, which kind of policies do you need in order to get to companies to think more in this integrated approach, to go beyond silos, but really look at them and say, how can we maximize our sustainable development impact? And so based on this very large effort of qualitative data, we looked at 6 countries, spoke with 60 different companies, and took like 1.5 or 2 years. This is kind of the what it all boils down to. It's a very simple model how we believe policies can influence business model innovation. And it's really about a carrot and a stick approach. And it really, it really very much resembles what Matt has been talking about, he used words like incentivizing. He was talking about households and private decisions, but this is the same for business, where policies need to be able to incentivize certain actions. But, and this is very important, is also something that Matt said, you need to incentivize proactiveness. You can't can't just kind of, be very, very strict on these businesses and say, give them very strict guidelines and say, you need to do X, Y, Z, and then you get, money for that, and then you're done. That's probably not going to cut it. And it's leaving a lot of innovation on the table. And so you need kind of these sector-specific policies, both on the strategy side and, the concrete policy instrument mix side, that create supportive conditions for businesses to come into a sector for innovations, and that those can in the instant, in first instance, those can be some subsidies. They can be technology push, a demand pull type instruments, and really creating this long-term strategy. But at the same time, you kind of have to steer companies and put certain constraints on them and say, we have these society-wide objectives as well, and these could be, of course, carbon compatibility, so low carbon. It could be inclusivity, justice of access. It could be all these different things that work much more across sectors. And these goals, if you want, these objectives, then serve as a guideline for these companies that you have to do this in a certain way. But the key thing is that you kind of keep the tension between these supportive mechanisms on the sector side and these more constraining mechanisms on a society-wide side, and let companies navigate within that space. And only if you do that, you're really able to foster and let companies come up with business model innovations that can navigate that space. And just a small knock actually on one of the World Bank policies that are being put out. World Bank has this performance-based grant, right, where you as a mini grid developer, you get money for connecting a household, and you get $300 per household. The thing with that is it incentivizes to do the same thing that you've always been doing and not really look left and right, right? You do it, you hold on your you hold on your hand, but just an electricity connection in itself doesn't do anything, right? Without any appliances, without any, electricity itself is no good in itself. But that is kind of creating a structure where it doesn't incentivize innovation because it is too narrow in its pathway. But if you can broaden that up and then think about supportive structures that allow companies to actually deliver on multiple objectives as well, and you can kind of keep these tensions, that's when these integrated business model innovations that we've seen in some countries really come to fruition. So it's really about maintaining these tensions and fostering proactiveness and not holding companies too much by the hand. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and back to Alex.
Great. Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, Philipp, and also for a little bit of friendly fire is always good. But I think I think this observation that basic services, should support value-added services that then make the basic services more sustainable, and we should figure that out from a policy side, makes a ton of sense. Okay, great. Look, we're quite tight on time. There's quite a few questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to triage this a little bit with your permission, and I'm going to just direct a few questions sequentially to each of the speakers in the order in which they've spoken, and I'll just exercise my prerogative to consolidate them a little bit. So Somik, if I may start with you, there's 2 or 3 questions here which are being upvoted a bit. So maybe I'll give you the questions, and if you have the time to just give a synthesized answer, that would be super with the 10 minutes or so we have left. So these questions are firstly, this is all with regard to the measurement of emissions and how weather systems are controlled for in those observations. A question really about the challenges of measuring scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So I guess this is this idea of point and diffuse, which you spoke a little bit about, but maybe there's something more you want to say that in terms of economic and policy design for financing mitigation. And then a third question is really about calculating dispersed emissions, so understanding transport emissions on intercity or rural roads and how that can be incorporated into the modeling. Somik, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. Let me take those 3 questions part by part. The first question on the weather systems, I think it's a really important question. And we faced a lot of queries of that sort when we wrote the paper. So the whole assumption here is that there's wind speed that sort of influences the flow of particles, and any measurement is kind of biased because of varying amounts of wind speed that may go in different directions. We appreciate that question, but the point is that the direction of winds in a city changes 100 times a day. And there are very few localized monitors that actually do a good job in getting the details of wind movement. So it's very easy to say there are wind speeds and things like that that disrupt measurement, but we have it's a very difficult empirical question. But on that, the issue is that the questions that people assume on wind speed are based on their knowledge of PM 2.5 and other kinds of localized air pollutants, not on carbon emissions. And the point is that what we do in our model is take into account a larger spatial extent of a city to take into account a 100-mile radius around it. So we take average emissions around those. And recall that the way we measure the data is that after about a week or so of the carbon CO2 particle in the atmosphere, it just kind of globally mixes out. So there's no way to kind of see the local component. So in a way, we kind of control for the weather or the dispersion issues using a larger kind of surface area of a city. But I think the point to measure is that unlike local CO2 particulates that move around very rapidly, here after a while, CO2 particulates just get absorbed into the broader atmosphere. Here, then in terms of what we measure, these are all direct emissions. These are Scope 1 emissions. We have not done any work on embodied carbon, so it's very difficult, I think, in satellite data to get a handle on that. So much of what we're going to do is just direct emissions. And the dispersed emission is exactly what I was saying, is that when you have transportation systems at the urban scale, it may not be at the point itself, the emission, but may come downstream. And so we take these buffer areas around the city, about 100 kilometers centroid. But having said that, I think the more important question that hasn't been asked is on the consumption of carbon-related goods that rise with incomes. So transportation demand, energy demand, all these things are very sensitive to economic development. So if you're in a poor African city and you have kind of a lot of people, it's not obvious to me that you'll have a lot of transportation-related emissions, and we show that in the data. But in middle-income cities, in fact, it is the demand for the income elasticity of demand is so high, the small changes in income leads to a lot more consumption, and that's where emissions kind of go up. So we have done a lot of that. Our working paper will be out next week, and we'll send a link to the organizers. Thank you.
Matt, there's a lovely philosophical question for you here. Is the market the best way to shape urbanization in Africa? Surely some good command and control would simply work better. Answers in a minute, please, Matt. Over to you.
So this is a great question. And Africa, of course, is urbanizing. For leaders in these countries, I want to know, in their system of cities, do the cities differ with respect to their climate risk? And will the leadership gently nudge the population to higher ground? If there's relatively safer cities within the system of cities, will both the free market and governments work together to nudge the newly urbanized population to the safer cities? And so, Alex, that's going to be one of my thermometers of Africa has to urbanize. Can it urbanize in a resilient way? And I think that the public sector and the free market can be partners there. And we could look back at when we go to COP27.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Matt, for that. Somik, is that your hand waving?
Sorry, I just had one thing to add to Matt's question, if I can, Alex.
Sure.
So I think in Africa, much of what the cities are growing they're growing in people, but not in land area, not in infrastructure. So the typical African city is just growing as being crowded. And all the structures being built are like putty, right? They're not very durable. So I would say, unless there are economic drivers that generate structural transformation in African cities, the patterns of urbanization are going to be very distorted. And if incomes rise in response to economic development, markets will play an important role. Planning systems are also conditional on economic development. There's a nice paper by Ed Glazer that talks about it. So I would say getting markets to work is a precondition for African cities to urbanize well.
Thank you. Jumping to Pia, so there's a couple of questions here for you, but let me just take this one. So the observation is made that countries like Sweden have a development policy that spans sectors from mining to technology, and South Africa may be similar. Do you think those sorts of development policies can be greened and then adapted to other locations?
Yeah, so I'm not particularly familiar with Sweden in particular, but I definitely think that learning from other countries and what has worked there, and thinking about what can be adapted and where the context is maybe very different, could be very useful. I was thinking more in terms of development policies, more about countries like China or South Korea that kind of upgraded their manufacturing capabilities, especially in complex products, quite rapidly, quite recently. But yeah, I think it's definitely useful to think about industrial policies around the world and why they work or don't work. In terms of mining and greening, I think there's something in there about the sort of how clean mining is as an activity. I'm not sure, but that's what I kind of hear. So I think we will definitely not be able to do without mining. And it's important to make sure that working conditions in mines are safe and of a high standard. And recycling is obviously also a big thing when it comes to these kinds of metals and electronics in general. But as far as I know, recycling is also often a very hazardous activity, even in rich countries. So I think it's important for policymakers to ensure that working conditions in these sectors are of a high standard.
That's great. Thanks so much, Pia. And Philip, in the last minute or so, if I may, there's an interesting question here which sort of describes how you use modeling to identify incentives and then think about how they can be set into policy to enable scale. And the question is, if you do this, how do you prevent accidental, sub-optimization lock-in settling in?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think that's an excellent question, and really, when I hear modeling, I'm also always reminded of this sentence that all models are wrong and only some are useful. So there are certainly some limits to what models can do in terms of lock-ins that are suboptimal. So what we did in this work, I'm an engineer. I usually work with models a lot, but I think if you want to really understand the intricacies of the different goals of sustainable development that are at play and the different business models that you can foster, you really need to sit down and talk and understand the local situation. So we really use qualitative data, which allows you to understand some of these conditions a lot deeper than maybe some models would, and so there is certainly a lot of complexity where I think you need models to model them, but you always need to sense check them with qualitative analysis and talking to people on the ground and really bringing this local level in, something that you also raised, right, Alex? And I think talking to people and actually taking the time is absolutely critical in this regard, and also ensuring that in your governance structure that you capture these elements.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Philip. We're at time. 30 minutes? We have longer than I thought. I beg your pardon. I thought we were right against it. Thanks for correcting me on there. So I wonder, just before we go maybe to the second line of questions that may emerge from here, can I take this back now, Rick, if you wouldn't mind, and maybe just talk a little bit about some of the observations, both from those presentations that may have struck you, or indeed some of the responses to those questions. Rick, over to you.
Yes. So these are all wonderful presentations, and they're extremely important. They also direct us away from the normal and a more kind of global, mondial, aggregate, macroeconomic way of looking at climate policy. So it's really good to go and look at the nitty-gritty, the very spatial micro effects. So to say something, so combining these satellite data with economic data on refineries, cement factories, steel factories, and you name it, it's just excellent stuff. Because then you can see where it comes from. So of course, you're not the first one to do this, because others have used this for particular questions like, for example, rainforests. Rainforests have been monitored in much detail because they're an important absorber of CO2. And really, you're doing that thing again as well. What I really like about this work is that you combine these data. We know exactly where the emissions are coming from. But we must realize that global warming has a lot of collateral damages as well. So a lot of these emissions from these factories, they may lead to global warming, but they may also lead to direct flow damages in the sense that they may have bad effects for health, like you think of for your lungs, for example. So what I miss in this work is the effect on people. So the effect on labor markets, the effect on local health issues, and things like that. And I'm reminded of the literature on the natural resource curves, which has gone away to look at very detailed micro level data, using the spatial information as well. And then not only look at the firms, but also look at what it means for individual communities, individual societies in the neighborhood of these big emitters. So they may not be suffering just from global warming, but they may be suffering from the collateral damages associated with health. But that's my big question there for the satellite new data sets which have been presented. Then I would also like to make a few other points, like, for example, the work that has been said by Pierre Andres and also her work with Penny Mealy. You talk a lot about this Hidalgo Houseman kind of way of the complexity approach, and to see have we got the right capabilities to really have a green transition. So I think you look there very much at the economic complexity, but there's also geographic complexity. We know again from the work on natural resources that in many of those industries in those countries are just all the transport was set up to just get to steal the mines, bring it immediately to the coast, and get it out of the country. That was done by the colonizers, including King Leopold and many others. But as a result, many of these African countries have very little trade between countries because all the infrastructure has been set up to get it out of the country as quick as possible. So what you see therefore is that a lot of these industries in those countries are not only economic anchors, the old fossil fuels, but they're also kind of geographic anchors. So that means it's very difficult to start up using this terminology of Haussmann and Hidalgo to really start up a big development path. So I think you need both the geographic component and the economic component. So if you kind of link up your studies, that would be absolutely wonderful. But having said that, then I think, of course, look at South Korea. That started off with just wigs, and then we can use those wigs to stuff kind of in the seats of cars. And wait a minute, no, we can actually make cars, and then it became slowly it became a very industrialized country. You can read Danny Roderick and many others on that. In a sense, you need this metaphor that the trees mustn't be too far away from each other, so that the monkeys can jump from one tree, from one branch of a tree to another branch of a tree. It's of course that's the point you're trying to make, and I think because these industries in the past have been so segmented, many of these countries have been so exploited. Related to that is, of course, that the green transition will lead to a new resource class, where there's a big need for raw materials, a big need, as you mentioned, a big need for critical materials. They may come not from the most countries with the best reputation, like Congo. We already feel guilty using a mobile telephone. And we will feel a lot more guilty once we need the raw materials to make our batteries. So what's happening there is then the attention is changing path from those very unstable countries and failed states, moving to the ocean bottoms, the ocean. So there's a lot of deep sea ocean mining. A lot of people are talking about to get those critical materials. So necessary to have the green transition because wind and solar energy is intermittent. So we have the big problem for the next 10, 20 years. How can we get the batteries? How can we get storage? And to get storage, you may need these critical materials you've been talking about. There's a huge demand for it, so I think we need more work on that. It's great. The math, of course, I love it every time we talk. I love it. I don't love you. Well, I do love you in a sense, but you really try to change the focus. I cannot say again and again and again that there's a kind of a taboo of talking about adaptation. Because if you're a greenie, talking about adaptation means that you're less motivated to do mitigation. And I know from Matt that, of course, it's both. We want mitigation and adaptation. Just because you're concerned about adaptation doesn't mean to say that you're not worried about mitigation. And to do adaptation properly, you have to get your incentives right. So every first year economics student gets taught Midland Prescott's kind of timing consistency issues. So that, for example, governments say, well, if you don't adapt or if you don't live, there's a flood, we're not going to help you. Of course, the governments will then do help. So then there is a kind of that people don't do enough adaptation. So there's a lot of hold-up problems there. But there are also lots of other incentive issues to do, whether private and public actions are strategic complements or strategic substitutes. I'd hope to think that they're strategic complements rather than substitutes, but it's something that we need a lot more empirical work on. Now we're doing kind of sophisticated cocktail party talk, but we need the proper nitty gritty of the empirics of that. Some people are doing research on that much better than I am. So and then Philip, you also talked a lot about your expertise is of course electricity, and the interesting thing is then there is going to be a revolution in energy, as you know, which I pick up from you, but you can go to these microgrids. That maybe so the way I see it is we used to think of, and I telephoned my girlfriend when I was your age. It was like I spent about 3/4 of my monthly salary. She was in Italy and I was in the UK. It was a really expensive relationship because that was how expensive telephoning was. Then it became that telephoning, the marginal cost is zero, but you have a fixed cost. Now, I think that's what's going to happen to energy. That you're going to have the type of market structure will be very different. That there'll be big fixed costs of setting these things, but once you sort it out, marginal costs will be very cheap at all. And then also the whole grid thing will change. So you really put the hammer on the nail in the sense that these microgrid problems and how you can have a green revolution in terms of energy in developing countries is the key question. It's always been the key question. Like the mobile telephones that many African countries just bypassed the land telephones in one go. Something similar might happen with the green transition, and by hell we need it. So thank you very much, all four of you, for these wonderful, inspiring talks.
Well, Rick, it's for us to thank you, I think, for that sort of tour de force in terms of both consolidating and summarizing those presentations, but also, again, putting some provocative questions. I am going to invite the panelists because I think in your remarks there were things that you were effectively asking back to some extent to those speakers, and I just want to give them the opportunity. And again, if I may, perhaps in reverse order this time, to see if they have any observations or comments to make, if time allows for that. So, Philipp, over to you.
Yes, so I would love to hear Matt speak a little bit more. Because I thought it was so interesting to see kind of the detail or the overlap in sort of how can policies incentivize proactiveness really. So policies and finance can only do so much. We all know that this needs a concerted effort from everyone. So I was wondering if Matt had any insights on kind of the mechanisms how policies can best do that and actually not just take people by the hand and guide them as far as the policy goes, and when the policy support stops, the action stops, right? So any insights on that would be really interesting, and it's certainly something that speaks to our work on the private sector business model innovations as well.
Thanks, Philipp. I mean, I will get Matt to respond directly, but Matt, just before I do, there was one other point that Rick was making about this idea of how these cost structures change, and actually as marginal costs fall to zero, the dynamic of these funding models will probably change. I wonder whether you have any comment on that, because I think there is a not quite an asymmetric relationship, but there is at least a phasing or a timing difference, right? In thinking about how productive use can be monetized vis-a-vis upfront capex costs, and whether the capex costs for example, the energy generating hardware, and I wonder whether in the work that you've been doing with IFA, you've taken that into account or thought about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting point that Rick makes here with this, that the marginal cost is going down, and it's really, if you think about, not the energy per se only, but actually the services. If you think about, I had this issue on cooling, right? So if you, why is this person transporting this fish on his motorcycle rather than in a cool truck, right? Because the cost of installing, a proper cold chain is just too high and it's prohibitive. But if you're a mini grid company and you come with this upfront investment that is quite high already, and you just increase it by 10 or 20%, then you can produce ice as much as you want and at almost very little marginal cost, really. So this really, and it is like that in a lot of sectors actually, where kind of the upfront investment in these appliances that enable productive use of energy, that's the prohibitive bit. The then paying for the OPEX should, it's a lot lower. So there is a lot of merit, I think, and a lot of potential in these servitization approaches, these servitization business models, and they are, because the cost is so marginal, they can work in very low income type of situations where you can then gradually build up demand. The thing is, though, that, and I think the big challenge here is that you integrate, as you do that, you integrate different sectors, and you really you have this big risk of this upfront investment that the financiers have to bear, or the companies have to bear. So while I see a lot of merit in this, in this approach to actually scale sustainable development solutions and productive use solutions, somebody needs to de-risk these integrated investments, and it's not gonna happen, I think, if you just kind of focus on very kind of a small scale type of and silo things. If you want to get these synergies, you need to kind of step out there and de-risk some of these integrated things to really be able to use these low marginal costs and scale them up.
Great, thanks, Philip. And Pierre, just before I come to you, if I may, Matt, come back to you, and would love your thoughts in response to both Philip's question, I think, just before that last comment, and of course to the broader comments that Rick made a little bit earlier. Would love your sense and reaction to that, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes. So briefly, Rick raised a crucial point that economists talk about the rules of the game to protect the next generation. So, folks, when I teach my students at USC, the young people in my class are so concerned about their future. And my pathway forward is for government to set the rules of the game. If for-profit firms are aware that carbon pricing is going to rise gradually, and if the US has a future Republican president, that he or she will not reverse that policy. So coming back to something Rick said, we need a political business cycle economic environment where investors have confidence that the green economy is here to stay. This expectation, almost like walking into an ocean, this expectation that carbon pricing will gradually rise, maybe that's more politically feasible. Alex, that this creates an economic environment where our best next generation of capitalists and entrepreneurs are stepping up to innovate along the last two presentations' lines. And individuals, Rick made a crucial point about commitment. I crack a joke, Alex, that many people don't find funny. I say, if Milton Friedman ran America's FEMA and said, tough love, no bailouts to places that have a disaster, people would be on their own. And would the American people be safer because of the dynamics that Rick pointed out? That if you don't anticipate a bailout, do people wake up and make choices to protect themselves? So I want my son to live in a world, again, where government and the people that there's these synergies in carbon mitigation, but also in adapting to these very real risks we face. When I see the Impossible Burger pop up, when I see improvements in housing design, when I see more efficient air conditioners fueled by green power, Alex, this is what makes me more optimistic about the free market leading to adaptation, but the government plays a key role here in setting the rules of the game.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt. It's a very inspiring framing, if I may say that. So, thank you for sharing, Pierre. I'd like if I may to come back to you, and thanks for your patience. And I'd love your reactions really in the first instance to some of Rick's remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. These were some really interesting comments, and I would say that infrastructure is definitely a very important factor to consider. I'm not sure I would classify it as part of geography as such because it's man-made, right? It's you made that point about colonizers setting up infrastructure to enable natural resource extraction, and so it's important to consider infrastructure, but also consider that it's built. So if the infrastructure right now isn't amenable to high complexity, high value added activities, then maybe there needs to be new infrastructure, which I guess we could think as part of the economic factors as well, which we could also think of as institutions in a way. Your other point was about there being a new resource curse. And I think it's really important to make sure that that doesn't happen because research-rich countries, sometimes they're very rich, like if we think about oil exporters, for example, but they also often don't make a lot of other stuff. And when, for whatever reason, like now with climate change, their resources no longer, other countries at least aim to use less of it, that leaves them in kind of a tough spot. And so maybe there's something to be learned here from how Norway has been handling its oil reserves. So maybe countries that are very rich in minerals that are important for the green transition could use that wealth to invest in other activities that aren't as bound to resources. And I think that's a really interesting thing to watch.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Pierre. There's still quite a few questions on Slido, so I will go back to those. Please feel free to add or append to those questions already on there. A number of questions are on there for Somik, who, due to his pressing schedule over in Glasgow, has had to get across to something else. But rest assured, particularly those questions that are in connection with the availability of the data and the accessibility of the data that he referenced and talked about in his presentation. So that working paper, as we know, he said will be out next week, and information in relation to that will also be available on our fantastic CCG website. So I think any information with regard to that you will be able to get hold of, and if there are any specific questions within there that aren't answered by what comes out, we'll be able to get that from you.
Alex, could I make a point? Could I make a point there?
Of course.
So,
Of course.
in my own research, I want to sell Somik's important work. In my own research, I documented that U.S. congressmen and women who represent high carbon districts do not support carbon pricing. So there's very interesting political economy of the politics matter, that in these democracies, these leaders are aware of their constituents' emissions and are voting their pocketbook. And so another payoff of Somik's data is better understanding the political economy of green coalition formation.
Yeah, such an excellent point. Thank you, Matt, for making it. So there's a question here that I think applies to in different ways to all of these panelists, and this is in relation to data and the effectiveness of data, and the question has been framed in terms of the effectiveness of data-driven financing and the challenges of scale, and I wonder whether the panelists have any comments or observations to be made about this scale and data challenge, and in particular whether there are roles that catalytic finance, concessionary finance, blended finance, or variants thereof may play in accelerating investments or even in catalyzing the data that is necessary to be able to make better quality decisions. So that's kind of an open question to all four of you. So the three panelists and Rick. whether you have any observations or comments to be made about these challenges of if these approaches are policy-driven approaches are fundamentally underpinned by data and financing. Where is the opportunity in terms of scale? Over to you, please.
Rick, this may turn into a question for you. At USC's economics department, we've been debating what environmental accounting institutions do we need? So Santa Claus knows who's naughty and nice. And if the ESG network, how are we going to grade whether Exxon is making progress on getting greener? If Exxon gets greener, is it a green firm that should attract green finance? Or should there be bright line rules of which companies are green and are not? And if we misclassify those companies, will green finance achieve its promise?
Yes, I think this is an extremely important thing. So carbon accounting, or if you want, but also methane accounting, it's still at its beginning. I mean, some countries are making progress, but there are no standards. I talked with the guys from IFRS, so that's international accounting, getting the same norms all the way around, but it's not standardized like other bits. So that's a real big issue. And it's again, I would like to point out that natural resources, where we have this resource charter, and we basically you have to publish what you pump up, and of course countries and oil companies didn't want to do that because it was kind of not very pleasant if people know what you're doing and that you're stealing from a particular country. But I think in this particular case as well, we must force throughout the globe countries to kind of demand that the annual reports, is a proper account for what the emissions are. Not just CO2, but also fine particles and also CH4 and a number of others. And I think I know for a start, partially because my partner is doing it, that there's a lot of progress on that for individual companies and individual countries. But we need a kind of more standardization so that it's not too much greenwashing. So it's absolutely crucial. And I think we should have benchmarking and then gradually kind of start with a salami tactic, start with doing it going to all be properly recorded, and then gradually tighten up the rules and get it better and better. But that's something that needs to be started. Of course, the international organizations are thinking about it. At OECD, I was at the conference. But we really need the accounting body. I mean, in the Netherlands, where I sometimes still visit, I noticed that we have a number of carbon accounting master degrees, that you can actually become a carbon accountant. And why not? And
yeah, no, so
better than being paid as an accountant.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you, Rick. But I mean, thank you for that. I think, if I can put my own 2 cents on this, I think the surfaces a broader issue, which is so in some of these presentations, we've been talking about the significance of scale and granularity in terms of the unit of account that we observe, and I sort of think about sustainability as ultimately is a capital allocation decision making challenge, right? Where do you allocate capital, and how, and over what timeframes? And I think one of the things that this conversation is surfacing is understanding these things in reductive ways doesn't really give you the observational insight to really understand what's going on. And I think Matt's presentation, Somik's, and Piers and Philipp's all make this point. So we can think beyond carbon dioxide and methane. We can think about sustainability in much broader terms, in terms of the water footprint, and other things that are, again, very spatially specified, right, and very location specific. And even in this generic scale of country level or company level reporting, we shouldn't miss the wood for the trees, because ultimately, and again, this point on adaptation absolutely makes this point. At what scale does the rubber hit the road? And it's a pretty granular asset level scale. And so I think where this whole debate around modalities of financing and sustainability need to go is to be able to embrace granularity and embrace data at that granular scale, and then have the capacity to make that information actionable and decision ready at either the policy level or the finance allocation level. And I think this is the direction of travel where all of this work needs to go if we're actually going to get stuff done. But that's my personal soapbox, and maybe that isn't my my prerogative to jump on, but let me throw my 2 cents in there. We're rapidly racing towards what is the end of this session. So I will again just take my prerogative, I think, to just thank the excellent quality of panelist presentations today. I think it's been a real learning curve for me. I'm always trying to make sure I'm making notes in case I have to say something about what people said, but I was listening in genuine interest and learning a lot from all of our speakers. I'd especially like to thank Rick for taking the time to come on and come in there with this really well presented synthesis. More than that, I would love to please thank all of those who either are in the audience physically or virtually, and this very good quality set of questions, not all of which we answered directly here, but all of which are on Slido, and the panelists will also have sight of those, and I'm sure can respond directly or indirectly to some of them after this. But with that, let me please thank all of you, and if we could give us a virtual a round of applause to our speakers and to our panelists and to our discussant, I'd be very grateful. And with that, let me hand it back to the studio and back over to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.